What if I told you that in 1600, the land we now call the United States wasn't just empty wilderness, but a place where empires clashed, revolutionary technologies transformed life, and a single decision set the stage for every war, law, and culture that would follow? This is the story America never taught you. The land in 1600, more than meets the eye. In 1600, the territory that would become the United States was home to hundreds of distinct indigenous nations, each with complex political systems, advanced agricultural practices, and deep cultural ties to their lands. From the Iroquoian Confederacy in the Northeast, whose democratic governance models would later influence U.S. founding documents, to the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, who had built multi-story stone cities and sophisticated irrigation networks centuries earlier, the continent was far from the untamed frontier portrayed in later narratives. Indigenous communities had already developed trade routes spanning thousands of miles, exchanging goods like shell beads, copper, maize, and pottery. The Haudenosaunee, Iroquoian, Confederacy, formed by the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations, had established a binding constitution, the Great Law of Peace, that prioritized collective governance, conflict resolution, and mutual respect for land and people. In the Southeast, the Mississippian cultures had constructed massive earthen mounds as ceremonial and political centers, with cities like Cahokia, in present-day Illinois, once housing tens of thousands of residents, making it one of the largest urban centers in the world at its peak. Agriculture was the foundation of most indigenous economies. Maize, beans, and squash, known as the Three Sisters, were cultivated in interdependent systems that enriched soil and provided balanced nutrition. These farming practices allowed communities to support large populations and develop specialized roles, from artisans to leaders. Meanwhile, coastal and riverine nations relied on fishing and shellfishing, using sophisticated tools and knowledge of seasonal cycles to sustain their communities for generations. European ambitions, empires on the move. By 1600, European powers had already begun to stake claims to North America, driven by competition for resources, religious fervor, and a desire to expand their global empires. Spain, which had established colonies in Florida, Mexico, and the Southwest, viewed the continent as a source of gold, silver, and converts to Catholicism. In 1598, Spanish explorer Juan de Oñate had led an expedition into present-day New Mexico, establishing a colony that would later spark conflict with Pueblo peoples over land, labor, and religious freedom. England, meanwhile, had failed in its earlier attempts to settle North America, most notably the Roanoke colony, which vanished in the 1580s. But by 1600, English merchants and monarchs were eager to catch up to Spain and France, seeing North America as a potential source of timber, fur, and new markets for English goods. Queen Elizabeth I had granted charters to explorers and trading companies to claim land in her name, and discussions about new settlements were underway in London's merchant circles. France, for its part, focused on the northern and central parts of the continent, establishing trade relationships with indigenous nations for furs, particularly beaver pelts, which were highly valued in European fashion. French explorers like Samuel de Champlain had already traveled through present-day Canada and the Northeast, building alliances that would shape future conflicts in the region. These European powers did not see themselves as invading foreign lands. Instead, they invoked the doctrine of terra nullius, empty land, to justify their claims, ignoring the presence and sovereignty of indigenous peoples.
The impact of contact, disease, trade, and conflict. Long before permanent European settlements were established in what is now the U.S., contact between indigenous peoples and Europeans had already begun to reshape life on the continent. The most devastating consequence was the spread of infectious diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus, for which indigenous communities had no immunity. Between 1500 and 1600, these diseases killed an estimated 50 to 90% of some indigenous populations, destabilizing societies, disrupting trade networks, and leaving communities vulnerable to conflict and displacement. Despite the toll of disease, trade between indigenous peoples and Europeans also brought significant changes. European goods like metal tools, guns, glass beads, and textiles quickly became integrated into indigenous economies and cultures. Metal axes and hoes made farming more efficient, while guns transformed hunting and warfare. However, this trade also created dependencies. As indigenous nations became reliant on European goods, they often competed with one another for access to trade routes and resources, leading to increased conflict. Religious conversion was another key aspect of European contact. Spanish missionaries in the Southwest and Florida worked to convert indigenous peoples to Catholicism, often building missions that served as both religious and administrative centers. While some indigenous peoples adopted elements of Christianity, many blended it with their own spiritual beliefs or resisted conversion entirely. In some cases, religious differences sparked violence, most notably the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which would be one of the most successful indigenous uprisings against European colonization in North American history. The English Plan, setting the stage for Jamestown. In 1600, the English were preparing for their most ambitious attempt yet to settle North America. The Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company granted a charter by King James I, who would take the throne later that year, was tasked with establishing a colony in the Chesapeake Bay region. The company's investors hoped to find gold and silver, establish trade routes with indigenous peoples, and create a base from which to challenge Spanish power in the Americas. The planning for the Jamestown colony, named after King James, began in earnest in 1600, with merchants, soldiers, and adventurers signing on to the expedition. The leaders of the company believed that the colony could be self-sustaining within a few years, and they provided the settlers with tools, seeds, and weapons to help them establish themselves. However, they also imposed strict rules. Settlers were required to work for the company, and any resources found would be shared among the investors and the crown. Little did the planners know that the Jamestown colony would face catastrophic challenges: starvation, disease, conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy, and internal strife. But their efforts in 1600 laid the groundwork for the first permanent English settlement in North America, which would be established in 1607. This settlement would mark the beginning of centuries of English colonization in the region, with profound and lasting impacts on indigenous peoples, African enslaved people, and the future of the United States.
Indigenous responses, strategy, and resilience. In 1600, indigenous nations across North America were actively responding to the growing presence of Europeans, developing strategies to protect their lands, maintain their sovereignty, and navigate new relationships. Some nations chose to form alliances with European powers, seeing trade and military support as a way to gain an advantage over rival indigenous groups. For example, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy initially traded with the Dutch and later the English, using European weapons to expand their territory and influence in the Northeast. Other nations chose to avoid contact with Europeans altogether, moving their communities to more remote areas to preserve their way of life. In the Great Plains, nomadic nations like the Lakota and Cheyenne continued to rely on bison hunting, largely untouched by European influence in 1600. Meanwhile, in the Southwest, Pueblo peoples were beginning to organize resistance to Spanish colonization as tensions grew over land seizures, forced labor, and the suppression of their religious practices. Indigenous leaders also recognized the need to adapt to changing circumstances. They studied European military tactics, learned new languages, and negotiated treaties to protect their lands and rights.
While these efforts would not prevent the eventual loss of most indigenous territory, they demonstrated the resilience and strategic thinking of indigenous communities in the face of unprecedented challenge. Global context: how 1600 shaped the world. The events of 1600 in what is now the United States were part of a larger global transformation. The rise of European empires was driven by new technologies like improved ships and navigation tools that allowed for long-distance travel and trade. The transatlantic slave trade, which had begun in the 15th century, was expanding rapidly, with enslaved Africans being brought to the Americas to work on plantations. By 1600, the trade had already had a devastating impact on African societies, and it would soon become a central part of the economy of the English colonies in North America. Religious conflict in Europe also played a role in shaping colonization efforts. The Protestant Reformation had split Christianity into competing factions, and European powers often sought to establish colonies where their faith could be practiced freely or imposed on others. In England, the Puritans and other religious minorities were beginning to discuss leaving Europe for North America, where they could build communities based on their own beliefs. This would lead to the establishment of the Plymouth colony in 1620, and later the Massachusetts Bay colony. The year 1600 also marked important political changes in Europe. Queen Elizabeth I of England died in March 1603, ending the Tudor dynasty and bringing King James VI of Scotland to the English throne as James I. James would play a key role in supporting English colonization of North America, granting charters to both the Virginia Company and the Plymouth Company. In Spain, King Philip III had taken the throne in 1598, and he continued his predecessor's efforts to expand Spanish power in the Americas. The legacy of 1600, foundations of a nation. The year 1600 was not a beginning or an end, but a pivotal moment in the history of North America. The interactions between indigenous peoples, Europeans, and eventually Africans would shape the political, economic, and cultural fabric of the United States. The systems of governance developed by indigenous nations would influence democratic ideals in the U.S. Constitution. The agricultural practices of indigenous peoples would provide the foundation for the colony's food supply. And the conflicts over land and sovereignty that began in 1600 would continue to shape U.S. history for centuries to come. The legacy of 1600 is also a complex one. It includes stories of resilience, innovation, and cultural exchange, but also of violence, displacement, and oppression. As we look back at this year, we're reminded that the history of the United States is not a single narrative, but a collection of many stories told from different perspectives. Understanding these stories is essential to understanding the present and building a more just and equitable future.